the morning of April 9th, 1288, a thick fog enveloped the Bach Dang River. Moving methodically through this misty veil were 400 Mongol warships. Their keels efficiently sliced through the water, bearing the mark of an empire that had conquered half the world. At the bow of the flagship stood Admiral Amarn, son of the Yunnan governor, a veteran of destroying the Song Empire, and arguably the Yuan dynasty's finest naval commander. He intently gazed forward toward the river mouths in the open sea, understanding that within a few hours his fleet would reach a safe harbor. Behind him lay the ruins of a failed invasion. Ahead lay home and the opportunity to regroup for another attempt to subjugate these tenacious Vietnamese. The tide was in full flow. The waters surged deeply and rapidly beneath his ships. Everything portended success. Then, from the morning mist, several small Vietnamese junks appeared. They seemed pitiful compared to his colossal warships, barely a tenth their size, their crews comprised of men who had been fleeing for months. They unleashed a few volleys of arrows, more as a diversion than a genuine attack, and then did precisely what Amarn expected. They turned and fled. Amarn allowed himself a fleeting smile. "Pursue them," he commanded. "Destroy them before they reach the tributaries." His captains needed no further encouragement. The heavy Yuan vessels advanced, oars working in unison, delving deeper into the river. The Vietnamese craft fled before them like hares before wolves. Their smaller hulls somehow managed to navigate the narrowing channel with desperate speed. The Mongol ships followed, their commanders craving one final victory to salvage the honor of this failing campaign. The Vietnamese boats continued their retreat, and the Mongol ships persisted in their chase. Deeper and deeper they ventured into the river. The banks gradually closed in on both sides, and beneath the rising morning tide, unseen by anyone aboard those 400 warships, lay a weapon that Admiral Amarn had dismissed as primitive. A weapon 350 years old. A weapon that, in just a few hours, would utterly obliterate the mightiest fleet in the world. But what Amarn didn't know, what none of his men could know as they pursued these fleeing Vietnamese boats deeper into the Bach Dang, was that they were already doomed. The only question remaining was how long it would take them to realize it. Allow me to tell you about Admiral Amarn, because if you want to grasp why what happened at Bach Dang was so devastating, so perfectly ironic, you need to understand precisely who this man was. Amarn Nazalan Albri was no court appointee playing at war. This man had forged his reputation through blood and fire. His father was the Mongol-appointed Khwarezmian governor of Yunnan, meaning Amarn grew up within the empire's machinery, understanding power from the inside. But unlike many sons of privileged individuals, Amarn distinguished himself on the water. During Kublai Khan's conquest of the Song dynasty, Amarn commanded the leading fleet that relentlessly pursued the remnants of Chinese naval power from Guangxi all the way to the coast. He battled against Chinese admirals who had built and commanded ships for 1,000 years, and he defeated them. When the Song launched their final desperate counterattack on Guangzhou in July 1278, it was Amarn who repelled them. This man knew naval warfare as a master knows his tools. In 1285, during the second Mongol invasion of Vietnam, Amarn himself pursued the Vietnamese king at sea. He drove King Tran Hung Dao from the coast near Hoang Son, narrowly missing his capture in April of that year. The king of an entire nation fled before Amarn's ships. That's the level of prowess we're discussing. Therefore, when Kublai Khan organized his third invasion of Vietnam in 1287, appointing Amarn as naval commander alongside generals Fanny Mahmud, it wasn't driven by sentiment or politics. It was cold, calculated strategy. If anyone could break Vietnamese resistance from the sea, it was this man. 500 warships, 18,000 marines, 70 transport vessels, tens of thousands of sailors. This was no mere diversionary force. It was an armada designed to crush a nation. And initially, everything proceeded exactly as planned. The two-pronged invasion, launched in late 1287, was colossal even by Mongol standards. Prince Tagan, Kublai's own son, led between 100,000 and 170,000 ground troops from Guangxi and Yunnan. Amarn's fleet sailed from Changzhou, intending to form a massive pincer movement that would strangle Vietnam into submission. The forces included Mongols, Jurchens, Han Chinese from 4 different provinces, Yunnanese troops, former Song soldiers who had defected, and even 17,000 Li troops from Hainan. This represented the full might of the Yuan dynasty, the successors of the Mongol Empire, bearing down on a single, minor kingdom in Southeast Asia. If you had posed the question to any military strategist of that era about the likely victor, they would have looked at you as though you were unhinged for even considering such an inquiry. On February 3, 1288, Prince Tagan's forces marched into Thang Long, the Vietnamese capital, known today as Hanoi. His warriors poured through the city gates, their weapons ready for the expected last stand. Instead, they were met with an eerie quiet. The city was deserted, yet not in a panicked flight, with belongings strewn about and doors left ajar. This emptiness signaled a meticulous, well-thought-out strategy. The grain stores were utterly bare. Nothing but dust remained in the numerous warehouses. Every last scrap of food, every useful tool an army might need, had vanished. The Vietnamese monarch had disappeared, his court likewise, and the army was nowhere to be found. The entire civilian population had melted into the countryside, vanishing like morning dew under the sun. This was a scorched earth tactic executed with surgical precision, leaving Tagan with only a hollow victory. An army exceeding 100,000 men cannot subsist on pride and conquered territory, and the Vietnamese had ensured there was nothing else left. Then, the true ordeal began. The Vietnamese had no intention of fighting, or rather, they had no intention of fighting under conditions favorable to the Mongols. There were no pitched battles, no grand clashes where the superior Mongol cavalry and tactics could dominate. Instead, there were ambushes, nocturnal raids, bridges collapsing under the weight of supply convoys, and roads that abruptly led into impassable swamps. Constant, relentless harassment denied the invaders any respite. The tropical heat, which the Vietnamese had endured their entire lives, became a tangible, oppressive force upon the Mongol soldiers. Men who had conquered the steppes of Central Asia and the plains of China found themselves utterly depleted just by existing in this scorching, humid environment. Diseases ravaged the camps. Supply lines stretched ever thinner, becoming vulnerable threads that Vietnamese partisans severed with increasing frequency. Then, in January 1288, the first major catastrophe occurred. General Chang Kandu, commanding the Vietnamese fleet stationed at Van Don Island near Ha Long Bay, had been observing and patiently waiting. He received intelligence about the approach of a massive Yuan dynasty supply fleet under the command of John Wenhu. 70 vessels, laden with provisions, were desperately needed by Tagan's starving army. Chang Kandu launched his attack with 30 warships. The Vietnamese descended upon Jan's supply fleet like sharks on wounded prey. They torched it, utterly burning everything to the ground. 70 ships, carrying 7 million kilograms of rice and supplies, transformed into floating infernos, illuminating Ha Long Bay. Some of Jan's remaining ships were blown off course by powerful northeast monsoon winds. Others drifted aimlessly in the chaos. Jan himself was forced to flee back to Hainan Island. When Van Chang Nank heard these reports, he immediately grasped their significance. The Yuan forces are most desperate for supplies, he declared. Perhaps they are not yet aware of the destruction of their transport fleet and are planning further offensives. But there will be no more offensives. The Mongol army in Thang Long, numbering over 100,000, began to starve. On March 5th, Tagan abandoned the capital he had captured only a month prior and retreated to the Yuan base in Huangqipe. By March 30th, with his situation growing more precarious each day, he ordered a full withdrawal to China. His army, once the pride of the Yuan dynasty, now resembled a shattered mob more than a triumphant force. The Vietnamese pursued them relentlessly. In Langsan, around April 10th, Prince Tagan himself was struck by a poisoned arrow. He had to abandon his warhorse and flee through the forests on foot, accompanied by a handful of loyal and able-bodied warriors. The majority of his ground forces were annihilated or captured during that horrific retreat. However, Amar's fleet remained intact, and this was what made it so dangerous. 400 warships represented too significant a force to simply write off. Even in retreat, they could bombard coastal positions, evacuate remnants of the ground troops, or form the core for another invasion attempt. Amar had to bring these vessels home to China, and there was only one practical route: down the Bach Dang River to the open sea. Amar felt confident as his fleet entered the river on the morning of April 9th. And why shouldn't he? He had defeated the Song dynasty fleet. He had pursued kings into the ocean. His ships were undamaged, his crews seasoned. The path of retreat was clear. Yes, the campaign as a whole had been a disaster. Yes, Tagan had suffered a crushing defeat on land. But Amar would save the fleet, and the fleet could be utilized again. Unbeknownst to him, a 60-year-old Vietnamese general named Tran Hung Dao had been meticulously preparing a special surprise for him over the past month. It was a strategy that Amar, with all his extensive experience, profound confidence, and expert knowledge, had dismissed as an outdated tactic from a more primitive age. He was about to discover that sometimes ancient methods endure precisely because they work. Centuries before Admiral Amar guided his fleet into Bach Dang, specifically in 938 AD, a Vietnamese commander known as Ngo Quyen confronted a similar predicament on these very shores. The adversary was Southern Han, a Chinese state whose protracted dominion over Vietnam had rendered independence an seemingly unreachable aspiration. Thus, Ngo Quyen observed a colossal enemy armada navigate this estuary, intent on quelling yet another Vietnamese uprising and reasserting Chinese dominance. What Ngo Quyen orchestrated next not only ended a millennium of Chinese imperial rule, but also became the stuff of legend. He instructed his warriors to embed hundreds, possibly thousands, of sharpened wooden stakes into the riverbed, their iron-tipped points angled upwards towards the river's mouth. During high tide, these stakes were completely submerged, invisible to any vessel sailing above. Ngo Quyen then dispatched a small squadron of nimble Vietnamese vessels to provoke the Southern Han fleet. These light boats executed hit-and-run attacks before retreating upstream. The Southern Han warriors, anticipating an easy victory, pursued them keenly in their heavy warships. As the tide receded, the water level dropped, and abruptly, the wooden stakes emerged from the river, resembling the fearsome teeth of some unseen colossal beast. The Southern Han ships, too unwieldy to stop or maneuver swiftly, impaled themselves on these concealed spikes. Hulls splintered and vessels capsized. Soldiers and sailors, weighed down by their armor, drowned, while Vietnamese archers on the riverbanks rained arrows upon anyone who attempted to swim to safety. Southern Han Prince Liu Hongkao perished along with the majority of his forces. This single engagement brought an end to Chinese domination over Vietnam. In 939, Ngo Quyen crowned himself king and relocated his capital to Co Loa, a site symbolizing traditional Vietnamese regality prior to the Chinese conquest. The message was unequivocal. Vietnam was Vietnamese once more, and would remain so for centuries to come. The Battle of Bach Dang in 938 established a foundational military legend for Vietnamese independence. Every Vietnamese child learned about those stakes. Every military officer studied that stratagem. And as Vietnam faced repeated invasions in subsequent centuries, commanders recalled this battle and drew inspiration from it. However, there's a particular characteristic to legendary tactics from bygone eras. By the 13th century, by the time of the Mongol invasions, wooden stakes in a riverbed seemed antiquated, primitive, a relic from simpler times before modern warfare evolved beyond such rudimentary approaches. The Mongols had conquered half the known world, employing sophisticated military tactics that would impress contemporary generals. This included complex combined arms warfare, coordinated cavalry, infantry, and siege weaponry, psychological operations designed to instill complete submission in enemies even before the first arrow was fired, and intelligence networks that meticulously mapped enemy territories and identified vulnerabilities with ruthless efficiency. They possessed siege engines capable of transforming fortified cities into rubble, and composite bows effective at seemingly impossible distances. They even utilized early forms of gunpowder weapons and gained naval expertise from subjugated Chinese shipwrights and mariners. This was the army that decimated the Khwarezmian Empire, subjugated Rus, devastated Eastern Europe, and ultimately overthrew the Song dynasty after decades of intricate military campaigns. These were not barbarian hordes. This was the most effective military machine the medieval world had ever witnessed. Amar epitomized this sophistication. He had learned naval tactics from Chinese masters and subsequently surpassed them in their own domain. He commanded vessels that embodied a century of technological advancement. His crews had fought in numerous naval engagements along the Chinese coast. When Amar surveyed Vietnamese fortifications, he viewed them through the eyes of someone who had studied and triumphed over advanced military systems. Therefore, when intelligence reports indicated that the Vietnamese might attempt to employ the old Bach Dang tactic, reports that almost certainly reached Amar's ears at some point during the campaign, what might he have thought? Imagine it from his perspective. You are an admiral who helped conquer the Song dynasty. You have pursued Vietnamese kings all the way to the sea. You command Asia's 5 most advanced warships, and someone suggests you should be concerned about wooden sticks in a river. The Southern Han dynasty, whom No Qin defeated in 938, was a regional power struggling to control southern China during a period of fragmentation. Admiral Amar represented the Yuan dynasty at its zenith, presiding over the largest contiguous empire humanity had ever known. The Song dynasty, which Amar had helped subjugate, possessed advanced warships that were technological wonders, boasting multiple decks, intricate sail designs, and even rudimentary forms of naval artillery. Yet, the Vietnamese insisted that wooden stakes would halt these formidable Yuan naval vessels. This concept must have appeared ludicrous, utterly absurd, akin to bringing a knife to a gunfight, or, in this instance, deploying an ancient maritime tactic against 13th century naval power. However, what Amar failed to grasp was that his extensive experience, profound knowledge, and overconfidence blinded him to the undeniable truth. The Bach Dang River was more than just a waterway, it was the paramount factor. The Bach Dang was an estuary, stretching over 2 kilometers at its mouth, where fresh water from numerous tributaries mingled with the saline waters of the Gulf of Tonkin. Like all estuaries, it experienced powerful tidal fluctuations, but the tides on the Bach Dang were particularly pronounced. From midnight until morning, the water levels surged with astonishing speed. The depth could increase by several meters, transforming shallow areas into deep channels, concealing rocks, shoals, and other submerged hazards. The incoming tide was swift and potent, moving upstream with enough force to push back a ship under oar. Then, around midday, the tide reversed course. The water didn't merely recede, it retreated with the same rapid intensity with which it had risen. Within hours, deep channels reverted to shallow flats. The sandy riverbed became exposed, and any stationary obstacle, safely submerged during high tide, suddenly became a perilous protrusion for any vessel that hadn't navigated out in time. The riverbed itself was uneven, rocky in places, with numerous tributaries feeding into the main channel. The Bach Dang snaked through mountainous terrain, creating unpredictable currents and whirlpools. It was a navigator's nightmare, even without the involvement of hostile forces. For the nimble Vietnamese boats, specifically designed over generations to navigate these very waters, the Bach Dang was a familiar domain. They knew the locations of the deep channels and understood how to interpret the currents. Crucially, they precisely understood the required draft and how to find it. In stark contrast, for the heavy, open-ocean warships of the United Nations, commanded by sailors from the Chinese coast who had never sailed these particular waters, the Bach Dang was a death trap waiting to close. They simply weren't aware of it yet. And concerning the tactic that was 350 years old, if people are still discussing it 3.5 centuries later, there's usually a compelling reason. General Tran Hung Dao was 60 years old when he opted to revive a weapon from the time of his great-great-great-grandparents. While this might not seem exceptionally old to us, in the 13th century, when most men considered themselves fortunate to reach 40, 60 was genuinely considered ancient. He had already defeated the Mongols once in 1285, using guerrilla warfare and scorched earth tactics to drive them back across the border. This earned him the title of Supreme Commander of all Vietnamese armed forces. He had proven his competence, making what transpired next even more remarkable. For when Tran Hung Dao unveiled his plan to his generals in March 1288, they must have believed the old man had finally lost his mind. The scene on the Ha River is documented in Vietnamese historical chronicles. Tran Hung Dao gathered his commanders and swore a public oath that staked not only his reputation, but his very life. If the Mongols are not defeated, he vowed before everyone present, we will never cross this river again. It was the kind of dramatic gesture that either cements one's legend or turns one into a cautionary tale of hubris. There was no middle ground. When you publicly pledge never to retreat, you don't. He then laid out his plan. They would employ wooden stakes driven into the bed of the Bach Dang River to annihilate Amar's fleet. I imagine the stunned silence that followed this announcement, because everyone in that room knew the story of No Quin, and everyone also knew that 350 years had passed since then. Naval warfare had evolved, shipbuilding had progressed. The Mongols were not the southern Han. This was the Yuan dynasty, for goodness sake, the people who had conquered China and were currently attempting to conquer Japan with the largest amphibious fleet in history up to that point. The unspoken question must have hung heavy in the air. Wooden stakes, really? Are we relying on that? Admiral Tran Hung Dao's response, as far as I can glean from historical records, essentially amounted to, yes, wooden stakes. My intent was to decimate him with a weapon so ancient he'd forgotten its existence, since Amar was preoccupied with modern tactics and intricate naval maneuvers, envisioning a battle in his comfort zone. He then detailed the process, and suddenly, it didn't seem so far-fetched. First, there was the meticulous tidal analysis. This wasn't merely a vague awareness of high and low tides. Tran Hung Dao spent weeks scrutinizing the precise tidal cycles of Bach Dang. He needed exact knowledge of peak high tide, the precise moment the water would begin to recede, its rate of descent, where the deepest channels would remain during low tide, the areas that would become exposed, and the water level at every hour of the day. This was scientific inquiry, not superstition. Tran Hung Dao was essentially conducting a detailed hydrographic survey using 10th century tools and methods. He measured, calculated, and coordinated everything with obsessive precision because the entire scheme hinged on impeccable timing. A few hours' discrepancy, either too early or too late, would mean Amar's fleet would either spot the stakes before entering the kill zone or escape before the tide dropped low enough to ensnare them. The window for success was incredibly narrow, demanding minute-by-minute planning. Next came the production of the stakes, where Tran Hung Dao's attention to detail truly shone. He didn't just order his men to fell trees and sharpen them. He specified particular wood types, ironwood, which the Vietnamese call limba, along with tu and sen wood. These were the hardest timbers available in Vietnam, wood that wouldn't rot or soften after weeks in brackish water, wood that could withstand the constant pressure of tidal currents without breaking or shifting. The stakes varied in length from 2 to 5 meters. Their lower ends were sharpened for easier driving into the riverbed. Some were encased in iron tips for increased lethality and durability. The tops were intentionally jagged or rough, designed to rip holes rather than merely puncture them. Crucially, Tran Hung Dao instructed his men to place these stakes at varying angles. Some stood upright, pointing straight up. Others tilted at a 15-degree angle, facing west. Still others were angled at 45 degrees, oriented south, towards the river mouths. This was no accident. It ensured that regardless of how a ship attempted to turn or evade the visible stakes, other stakes awaited to catch it from a different angle. The stakes were arranged in a zigzag pattern, like a giant Z stretched across the riverbed, with individual stakes spaced approximately 0.9 to 1.5 meters apart. This spacing was close enough to compel even light boats to navigate cautiously, yet sufficiently wide so that at high tide, when the stakes were submerged, the river appeared completely unremarkable to anyone sailing over them. Then came the most arduous part, installing these damned things. Stakes could only be driven into the riverbed at low tide, when the bottom was exposed. This limited Tran Hung Dao's workers to narrow daily windows for progress. and it was March in northern Vietnam, bringing cold rain, northeast winds, and generally horrendous working conditions. Historical records specifically note workers driving these stakes in icy rain, a testament to the discipline and dedication required. They had to install hundreds, possibly thousands of these stakes across multiple locations. The primary stake fields were situated in 3 river tributaries, Tran, Ken, and Rude, all feeding into Bach Dang from the north. Additional stake fields were established in Chao Kuai, near Hyong, and in Yan Yang, Quang Ninh Province. This wasn't a single choke point. It was a series of overlapping kill zones designed to drive Ammar's fleet into an inescapable trap. All of this had to be executed in absolute secrecy. If Ammar had learned of these preparations, if a scout had spotted the stakes during low tide, the entire plan would have crumbled. The Vietnamese would have revealed their strategy, and weeks of arduous labor would have been wasted. Therefore, the work proceeded quietly, carefully, under such stringent security that even many Vietnamese soldiers were unaware of what was being prepared. Finally, Tran Hung Dao positioned his military forces. A small Vietnamese fleet, tasked with luring Ammar into the trap, concealed itself behind Gongkok Reef and other natural features, out of sight from the river's mouth. Land forces garrisoned both banks of Bach Dang, hidden within vegetation and behind natural topography. They had fiery arrows at the ready, gathered stones for launching, and prepared flammable materials to hurl at enemy vessels. Everyone was in place, waiting. Now, I want you to consider Tranda's actual actions. He was 60 years old. He confronted an admiral who had helped conquer the Song dynasty, commanding a fleet that was only a fraction of what he faced. The odds were so overwhelmingly against him that even his own generals likely harbored doubts. But Tranda grasped something Ammar, for all his experience, did not. He understood that the fundamental essence of warfare lies in aligning the right tool with the right circumstance. Ammar brought advanced warships designed for open ocean combat. Tran Hung Dao brought the river, the science of tides, wooden stakes, and patience. Had it been a competition of superior ships, Ammar would have triumphed. Had it been a test of greater naval combat experience, Ammar would have prevailed. If it came to crew training or fleet size, Ammar would have consistently held the advantage. But Tran Hung Dao offered him different terms. He presented Ammar with a simple choice: navigate the Bach Dang River at high tide, or seek another route. And Ammar, confident in his vessels, crews, and his own abilities, chose the river. Sometimes, the greatest military victories are not claimed by the nation with the best technology, but by the one with a deeper understanding of the battlefield. Ammar was an expert, but Tran Hung Dao was fighting on his home ground. That changes everything. Allow me to elaborate on what occurred on April 9, 1288, because these specifics are crucial, and understanding them allows one to fully appreciate the flawless execution of this disaster by Tran Hung Dao. The morning commenced with fog, a common occurrence on a spring morning in the estuary, but dense enough to limit visibility to a few hundred meters. Ammar's fleet entered the Bach Dang on a high, rising tide, as the water level neared its peak. If you were on the deck of one of these Yuan ships, gazing down at the water, you would see nothing but the dark river flowing beneath you, deep and swift. Seemingly unobstructed, the flotilla advanced in formation. 400 warships plus support vessels, thousands of men. The pride of Yuan naval power in Southeast Asia. They had been retreating for days, exhausted by the relentless pursuit of Vietnamese forces. And everyone aboard these ships yearned only to reach the open ocean and return home. The mouth of the Bach Dang loomed ahead, likely visible through breaks in the fog, promising salvation from this cursed land that had swallowed their invasion. Then, from the fog, Vietnamese boats emerged. There were few of them, perhaps 20 or 30 light junks, minuscule compared to the enormous Yuan warships. They came from tributaries and from behind reed beds, firing arrows as they moved. This was not a serious assault, but rather a continuation of the debilitating tactics they had employed for weeks. Pinprick raids that caused more annoyance than damage. What one might expect from a defeated enemy making a final, desperate gesture. Amar's commanders hardly needed orders. They knew what to do with fleeing Vietnamese boats: pursue, overtake, destroy. The Yuan warships surged forward. Oars rhythmically cut through the water. Sails caught the remnants of wind filtering through the fog. It felt good, finally, to go on the offensive after a week of retreat. It brought a sense of restored dominance. The Vietnamese boats fled. And this is important. They fled convincingly. These were not vessels conducting a fighting retreat, pausing to fire, then withdrawing to fire again. These were boats escaping in obvious panic. Their crews rowed with all their might, selecting any course that offered them the best speed away from the pursuing warships. They looked defeated. They looked scared. They looked exactly as Amar expected. So the Yuan fleet chased them deeper into the river. The Vietnamese boats escaped upstream, following the main channel, and the Mongol ships followed. Now they were entirely committed. The entire fleet moved as one. Captains competed to be the first to catch the enemy, and the riverbanks gradually narrowed on both sides, but not too sharply. It was still a wide waterway, ample space for naval maneuvers, no cause for concern. The Vietnamese continued to retreat. The Mongols continued to pursue. Minutes turned into an hour stretched longer, and all this time, Tran Hung Dao, observing from his position along the riverbank, waited for one specific event: the change of the tide. It arrived around mid-morning, that barely perceptible moment when the water stops rising and begins, almost imperceptibly at first, to fall. If you weren't specifically looking for it, you wouldn't notice. The current shifts, transitioning from an upstream push to a pull towards the sea. The water level, previously appearing stable, begins to recede. Vietnamese vessels continued their retreat, though now their withdrawal seemed more organized, as if adhering to specific routes, navigating through tributary mouths, and utilizing channels that progressively narrowed and shallowed as the morning advanced. Several commanders under Tran Hung Dao, those who grasped the unfolding situation, started disengaging from active participation. Their mission was accomplished, losses sustained, and it was now time to depart the kill zone. The Mongol fleet persisted in its chase. They were too deeply committed to turn back. Besides, why were the Vietnamese right ahead, finally engaging in battle instead of fleeing inland? A few more minutes, and they would be within bowshot. A few more, and it would be hand-to-hand combat, where Mongol discipline and training invariably prevailed. Then, someone on one of the leading Yuan ships felt a scraping sensation beneath the hull. A slight brush against an underwater sandbar was likely perceived as a barely noticeable resistance. The captain probably immediately ordered a minor course correction. Nothing serious, just to clear an obstacle they had grazed. Soon, another vessel. And then a third struck the bottom. Somewhere in the midst of this fleet, perhaps on the flagship, Admiral Amar must have experienced the first chilling pangs of realization. He would have glanced at the water level, then at the riverbanks, which now appeared somewhat higher than an hour ago, and observed how the Vietnamese boats, those nimble, flat-bottomed junks, continued to move freely, while his heavy warships were already beginning to feel the riverbed. The tide was ebbing. The water was receding, and at that moment, the first wooden stake emerged on the surface. Imagine a dark, roughly hewn form, perhaps 3 or 4 inches in diameter, rising from the water like an accusing finger. One stake, then another, then 10, then hundreds, appearing across the river's width as the water level dropped, revealing what had been hidden beneath the surface for weeks. This realization struck the UN commanders like a physical blow. These were not natural obstructions. These were wooden stakes. Someone had intentionally driven wooden stakes into the riverbed, and this meant, turn around. Orders echoed across the fleet. Return to the sea, alter course. But it's impossible to pivot 400 warships instantly, especially in a river channel that was becoming shallower by the minute. The leading ships attempted to turn, colliding with vessels behind them. Captains shouted conflicting orders. Ropes became entangled, formations dissolved into chaos, and the tide continued to recede. More stakes materialized. The water level dropped with that peculiar swiftness unique to tidal rivers, as if withdrawing from the sides of the stranded ships. It seemed the river itself was abandoning them. What had been a navigable channel 30 minutes prior was transforming into a forest of wooden spikes. The first ship impaled by the stakes likely tried to turn too sharply. Or perhaps it was simply unlucky enough to be directly over one of the larger stakes when the ebb tide reached its critical point. A stake 3 or 4 meters high, deeply embedded in the riverbed and angled at 45 degrees towards the river mouth, pierced the hull like a spear through paper. Wood splintered with a sound resembling a tree cracking in a storm. Water immediately began gushing through the breach. The ship's bow rose. Its center of gravity shifted as the bilge filled with water. Men scrambled across the tilting deck, screaming, trying to get overboard before the vessel completely capsized. Then another ship impaled itself on the stakes, and another. The heavier the ship, the more firmly it settled onto them as the water retreated. The UN warships, designed for oceanic combat with deep keels and reinforced hulls, proved particularly vulnerable. They sat lower in the water than the lighter Vietnamese vessels, meaning they contacted the stakes sooner and more forcefully as the water level dropped. Some stakes perforated the hull from below. Others, angled, snagged ships attempting to deviate from the main field of stakes, ripping holes along their length. The zigzag pattern devised by Tran Hung Dao meant there was no safe direction. Turn left, you hit stakes. Turn right, you hit stakes. Try to retreat, you hit more stakes. The entire river channel had become a deadly trap. Crews abandoned ships, leaping into the water, believing they could swim to the banks. But there wasn't enough water for swimming. In places, it was knee-deep. In others, thigh-deep, with treacherous currents and a silty riverbed that sucked at their feet with every step. Armored men became mired in the mud, unable to move forward or back, slowly submerging as they struggled. Mongolian vessels began colliding with one another. Amidst the pandemonium of attempts to alter course, captains lost their formations. Ships that managed to evade the barrier crashed into those that couldn't. Oars shattered and hulls splintered from the impact. On certain ships, desperate crews attempted to disembark onto the riverbanks, believing captivity was preferable to drowning. However, the Bach Dang riverbanks were not convenient sandy beaches. They consisted of muddy reed thickets and treacherous ground, offering no real safety. The tide receded further, exposing more stakes. Ships that were merely grounded suddenly found themselves punctured as the stakes directly beneath their keels rose to meet them. The sound must have been horrifying. The splintering of wood, the screams of men, the shouts of officers that no one could obey. And beneath it all, the persistent, relentless noise of the receding water around the hulls, leaving the ships impaled on these wooden stakes like fish in a drained pond. Then, the Vietnamese launched their assault from both sides of the river. From meticulously prepared and pre-positioned locations, Tran Hung Dao's ground forces initiated fire. Initially, arrows, thousands of projectiles, rained down in waves on the trapped ships. The Mongolian crews found themselves unable to retaliate effectively. They were on unstable decks, their vessels listing at impossible angles, and half their attention was consumed with avoiding falling into the water or being crushed between colliding ships. Incendiary arrows followed, their flaming shafts embedding themselves in wooden decks and sails, igniting fires that rapidly spread in the dry spring air. Ships not impaled on stakes also caught fire. Crews faced an impossible dilemma: remain on a burning vessel or leap into the shallow, silt-laden waters where Vietnamese soldiers lay in wait. Stones and combustible materials cascaded onto the fleet. The Vietnamese had prepared these caches along the banks in advance. Now, every flammable object that could be hurled or fired at the captured ships was deployed. Isolated blazes merged into colossal conflagrations. Smoke intensified the chaos, diminishing visibility and further hindering Mongolian commanders from coordinating any organized defense. Vietnamese infantry advanced into the shallow water, moving with the confidence of those fighting on familiar ground. They wielded weapons designed for close-quarters combat in water and mud, adept at navigating the treacherous terrain without getting stuck. They confronted an exhausted, demoralized, and literally immobilized foe. It was not a battle, but a slaughter. The low tide reached its nadir around noon. By this point, the main channel of the Bach Dang resembled the aftermath of an earthquake, hundreds of now fully exposed wooden stakes protruding from the riverbed at various angles. Impaled on these stakes were UN warships in various states of disrepair. Some were perforated from below and slowly sinking. Others had capsized, their keels pointing skyward. Still others burned, sending columns of black smoke into the afternoon sky. Bodies floated in the remaining pools or lay sprawled in the mud. Some Mongolian soldiers attempted to surrender, discarding their weapons and pleading for mercy. A few were taken captive, but others were cut down on the spot. For in the heat and chaos of battle, restraint is not always possible, and the Vietnamese had months of invasion and destruction to avenge. Amar himself was captured somewhere during this catastrophe. Historical accounts do not specify precisely when or how, only that he was taken alive, suggesting either extraordinary fortune or perhaps deliberate efforts by the Vietnamese forces to capture him rather than kill him. Prisoners held value. A captured admiral, especially one as distinguished as Amar, possessed significant worth. By sunset, the Battle of Bach Dang was concluded. Casualty figures from various sources vary widely, as is common for medieval battles. However, the most conservative estimates indicate tens of thousands of Mongols killed or captured. Some Vietnamese chronicles claim 300,000 dead or captured, a number that seems incredibly high until one considers that it likely includes not only sailors and marines, but also foot escorts and auxiliary personnel who accompanied the fleet. The material losses were undeniable. 400 UN warships, some were utterly destroyed, either impaled on stakes and sunk or burned to the waterline. Others were captured intact, albeit damaged. 100 warships were destroyed, with a total of 400 rendered inoperable. The entire naval component of the Third Mongolian invasion was annihilated in a single day. The perfect culmination of this disaster arrived a few days later, when Zhang Hu Wenhu, commander of the supply fleet tasked with reinforcing the invasion, finally approached the landing site. He was unaware of the Battle of Bach Dang, or that Tagan had already retreated to China. He directed his supply vessels precisely into the very same timeless system now completely dominated by Vietnamese forces. They, too, obliterated his naval contingent. Zhang Hu himself managed to escape with a mere handful of soldiers, fleeing all the way to Hainan. However, his provisions, food, and equipment, which might have salvaged some aspect of the invasion, either sank or fell into Vietnamese hands. Within a few months, Vietnam had dismantled 3 significant Mongol forces: Tagan's ground troops, Amar's combat fleet, and Zhang Hu's logistical convoy. This third invasion concluded as such an utter catastrophe that it defies comprehension. All because of wooden stakes embedded in the riverbed. When this news reached Kublai Khan's imperial court in China, the emperor's reaction was explosive. Consider Kublai Khan's stature at this juncture in his life. He was Genghis Khan's grandson, the individual who finalized the conquest of China and founded the Yuan dynasty. He had vanquished the Southern Song, one of the medieval world's most advanced states. He presided over humanity's largest contiguous empire, stretching from Korea to Eastern Europe. By all accounts, he was among the most triumphant rulers of his era. And yet, for the third time, this small Southeast Asian kingdom had crushed his military might. But on this occasion, it wasn't merely a defeat, it was a complete annihilation. 400 warships vanished, along with tens of thousands of soldiers. His son, Tagan, leading the land forces, was wounded by a poisoned arrow and forced to flee through the jungle like a common criminal. Kublai's fury towards Tagan was immediate and overwhelming. He exiled his son to Yanyu for life, forbidding him ever to be seen again. This wasn't imprisonment, as Tagan still held his princely status. Rather, it was a definitive banishment from court, stripping him of all military command or political influence. It represented the harshest penalty Kublai could impose without resorting to execution, and he applied it without hesitation. The message was clear: a failure of this magnitude would not be tolerated, even from a family member, especially a family member. However, the person Kublai most desired to recover was Amar, not for punishment, but for reinstatement. Amar was a valuable asset. He was the admiral instrumental in conquering the Song dynasty. His experience and expertise were difficult to replace. Yes, he had lost the fleet, but he was merely following orders, executing a strategy that Tagan had botched on land. Moreover, he was alive, which meant he could potentially lead another naval campaign. The Vietnamese, for their part, initially appeared receptive to negotiations. King Tran Hung Dao proposed a settlement. Vietnam would formally accept vassal status under the Yuan dynasty, regularly pay tribute, and acknowledge Yuan supremacy, provided Kublai Khan abandoned his expansionist ambitions and released Vietnamese captives. This was a face-saving compromise. Vietnam would retain internal autonomy, while China asserted nominal suzerainty. Part of these negotiations involved the repatriation of captured Yuan officials and soldiers. In 1289, King Tran Hung Dao agreed to send Amar home. The admiral was placed on a ship bound for China. It seemed peaceful resolution was at hand. Then, the ship simply sank. Somewhere between Vietnam and China, the vessel carrying Amar back to Kublai's court sank, and the admiral drowned. Of course, ships do sink. It happens, especially in the Middle Ages when navigation was imprecise and shipbuilding quality varied. But Vietnamese historical records quite clearly indicate what truly occurred. Prince Tran Hung Dao, who had initially opposed Amar's return, orchestrated the ship's sinking. He ordered the vessel to be deliberately scuttled, killing his captured adversary rather than allowing him to return to China, where he might lead another invasion fleet. Whether this was done with King Tran Hung Dao's knowledge or against his wishes remains unclear. Sources suggest the king genuinely desired peace and was willing to make concessions to achieve it. And though Tran Hung Dao remained convinced that the only good Mongol commander was a dead one, Amar drowned nonetheless. When Kublai received this news, he lost what little composure he had left. Historical chronicles describe him falling into a rage bordering on madness. He swore to erase Vietnam from the map. He immediately began planning a fourth invasion that would make the previous three seem like reconnaissance patrols. This was to be total war, complete extermination. He intended to depopulate the entire country if necessary. No more limited campaigns with specific objectives, only utter destruction. And, frankly, I understand him. Put yourself in Kublai's shoes. You conquered China, Asia's most developed, populous, and wealthy state. You expanded Mongol power to its maximum extent. You command an empire spanning continents. You've grappled with uprisings, succession disputes, and administrative challenges that would have crushed lesser rulers. Yet, this tiny Southeast Asian kingdom persists in defying you, repeatedly vanquishing your forces and continually humiliating your generals. And now, they've not only annihilated your fleet, but also assassinated the admiral you most desired to recover, in what was clearly a premeditated political killing. The sheer affront would alone justify another invasion in Kublai Khan's mind. Factor in the strategic considerations. Vietnam's geographical position, commanding vital trade avenues, and its potential as a staging ground for further campaigns in Southeast Asia. This creates a situation where another military expedition became unavoidable. However, Kublai Khan never initiated that fourth invasion. In 1294, 6 years after the Battle of Bach Dang River, Kublai Khan passed away. He was almost 80, a remarkably advanced age for that era. His death occurred before he could marshal the extensive punitive expedition he had envisioned, and with his demise, the entire political landscape shifted. Kublai's successor was his grandson, Timur Khan, who approached the Vietnamese dilemma from a completely different perspective. Timur proclaimed that the war with Dai Viet was over, concluded. He dispatched emissaries to Vietnam with the goal of re-establishing friendly relations. No more invasions or military campaigns, merely a formal arrangement where Vietnam acknowledged the suzerainty of the Yuan dynasty in exchange for being left undisturbed. Why such a profound policy change? Partially because Emperor Timur faced his own domestic political troubles and couldn't afford to squander resources on what was evidently a losing proposition. Partially because 3 failed attempts demonstrated that Vietnam was unconquerable with the forces the Yuan were prepared to commit. And partly, one suspects, Even the Mongols eventually realized that some objectives aren't worth the immense costs of their pursuit. Vietnam never sent its king or a prince to the Yuan court, a major sticking point in negotiations that Kublai had insisted upon as a token of true submission. The Tran dynasty maintained the facade of vassalage while preserving complete internal autonomy. They offered tribute and dispatched diplomatic missions, but in reality, they never submitted in any significant sense. And the Mongols never invaded Vietnam again, neither Timur nor his successors. The Yuan dynasty endured until 1368, for approximately another 70 years. Throughout this entire period, they never once tried to subjugate the kingdom that had humbled them thrice. This irony is almost poetic. The Mongol Empire, which conquered lands from Korea to Hungary and defeated every major military power in its path, was halted by wooden stakes in a river. The sophisticated military might of the Yuan, with its advanced innovations and seasoned commanders, was obliterated by tactics that were already 350 years old when implemented. Had you told Kublai Khan at the zenith of his power that his invasion of Vietnam would be thwarted by wooden poles driven into a riverbed, he would have scoffed at you. Had you told Admiral Amar, as he sailed into the waters of Bach Dang that April morning in 1288, that he was about to be annihilated by a weapon his experience taught him to disdain, he would have dismissed you as insane. But that is precisely what transpired. Sometimes experts are mistaken. Sometimes advanced technology succumbs to simple yet flawlessly executed strategies. Sometimes ancient methods succeed precisely because they are ancient, because they have been tested, refined, and validated over centuries. And occasionally, just occasionally, the people you considered primitive and inferior proved to be more astute than you imagined. The Mongols learned their lesson at Bach Dang, though they paid an exceptionally high price for it. The Battle of Bach Dang was not accidental. Tran Hung Dao was not simply lucky. Amar did not make a catastrophic blunder. It was a masterpiece of planning, preparation, and execution, because Tran Hung Dao comprehended something fundamental about warfare that Amar had overlooked. Tran Hung Dao employed meticulous observation and precise measurements to devise a weapon perfectly suited to the specific circumstances. Those weeks spent studying the tides at Bach Dang constituted a genuine hydrographic survey. He measured depths hourly, calculated the ebb and flow, determined the rate of water level changes, identified the strongest and weakest currents, and mapped the riverbed's topography. He predicted that if the Mongol fleet could be lured into the river during high tide and detained there until low tide, their ships would become ensnared. Stakes angled specifically would impale vessels maneuvering in various directions. Vietnamese boats, being lighter and having shallow drafts, would glide over the stakes, while the heavier Mongol warships would become stuck. He was correct in every aspect. This was a miscalculation on Omar's part, as he relied on his past experience, but also on assumptions that hadn't been tested in this specific scenario. He was familiar with naval warfare from coastal China, different rivers, and different conditions. His experience suggested that Vietnamese boats were inferior to Yuan dynasty vessels on the open sea. Retreating by river seemed safer to him than retreating overland. There was no perceived need to worry about tactics from 350 years prior. All of this thinking was logical, yet entirely incorrect for Bach Dang. In April 1288, Tran Hung Dao instructed his workers to drive hundreds of stakes into the riverbed during low tide, amidst heavy rain, while maintaining secrecy for several weeks. Each stake had to be precisely angled and spaced to create overlapping zones of impact. Fleet commanders were tasked with engaging superior enemy forces, sustaining losses, and then retreating on command, luring the Mongols into the trap without panicking or breaking formation. This required incredible precision. Ground troops had to remain hidden for hours, observing passing enemy ships, awaiting the signal to attack without revealing their positions too early. Every element had to align perfectly: the tide at the correct level, the Mongol fleet in the optimal position, and the troops ready. If any single element failed, the entire plan would crumble. However, nothing faltered. Everything unfolded exactly as envisioned. Tran Hung Dao understood Omar's overconfidence and exploited it ruthlessly. Admiral Omar, who had defeated the Song dynasty fleet, pursued Vietnamese monarchs by sea and commanded advanced 10th-century vessels, interpreted Vietnamese tactics as predictable. From his perspective, it was guerrilla warfare, involving sudden raids and debilitating skirmishes. He believed they avoided direct confrontation because they couldn't win an open battle. When Vietnamese boats appeared and then immediately withdrew, Omar took it at face value. The power of bias is immense. We tend to see what we expect to see. Omar expected the Vietnamese to flee, so their retreat raised no questions for him. Tran Hung Dao leveraged this self-assurance to his advantage, providing Omar with precisely what he anticipated until the low tide arrived, transforming those expectations into a deadly trap. The Bach Dang River wasn't merely a body of water, it was perfectly suited for such tactics. Powerful tides caused significant fluctuations in water levels. Numerous tributaries and complex terrain made navigation difficult, even without any obstructions. The riverbed was firm enough to hold stakes, but not so rocky that they couldn't be driven in. Had Omar retreated via a different waterway, with weak tides or deep channels navigable at low tide, this strategy wouldn't have worked. But the environment itself made the weapon effective. Tran Hung Dao simply recognized this potential and developed his tactics based on this reality. The Mongols, despite their military genius, sometimes underestimated such factors. They conquered steppes using mobility and cavalry, and adapted to siege warfare in China by adopting Chinese expertise. However, they struggled in environments that negated their advantages, such as the Vietnamese jungles, where cavalry was useless and heat exhaustion was a constant threat, or the Japanese typhoons that twice decimated their invasion fleets. Terrain can sometimes be more crucial than technology or training. The stakes themselves didn't obliterate the fleet, they immobilized it. The fleet was destroyed by fire arrows, and ground forces eliminated the crews. The shallow waters prevented escape. Psychological shock shattered the Mongols' morale. Each element amplified the effect of the others. Ships impaled on stakes couldn't maneuver to dodge fire arrows. The flames forced crews into the water, where ground troops awaited them. The inability to escape and the horrifying sight of their fleet stuck on wooden stakes caused panic, making organized resistance inconceivable. This sophisticated intricacy was what Omar failed to perceive. He saw wooden stakes and considered them primitive weapons. He should have recognized a complex system of interconnected tactical elements, each meticulously designed to compensate for Vietnamese weaknesses and exploit Mongol vulnerabilities. Technology doesn't win wars, strategy does. Having superior weaponry is beneficial and provides an advantage, but it isn't the decisive factor. What matters is aligning your capabilities with the actual situation. Omar brought advanced warships to a battle that demanded an understanding of tidal rivers. He applied naval expertise honed against Chinese admirals in a confrontation with Vietnamese guerrilla tacticians. He arrived with preconceived notions of how war should be waged in an environment where those notions were dangerous. Tran Hung Dao brought wooden stakes to a tidal river and emerged victorious. The experts were mistaken. Ancient tactics proved correct. Primitive weaponry, in fact, proved perfectly suited for this particular engagement at this specific location against this specific adversary. The 400 Mongol ships paid the price for this lesson. In 1953, Vietnamese laborers constructing a dike in Communiaziang, Quang Ninh Province, dredged riverbed silt and struck something solid. Ancient, dark, and weathered timber stakes, yet still remarkably sturdy. After centuries submerged in salt water and mud, they unearthed the palisades. Hundreds were found driven deep into the riverbed, precisely where Tran Hung Dao's forces had planted them 665 years prior. Some stood upright, others angled between 15 and 45 degrees, still positioned to impale vessels from multiple directions. Their lengths varied from 2 to 5 meters, and their sharpened tips remained intact. This discovery created a sensation throughout Vietnam, immediately prompting the deployment of archaeological teams. Meticulous excavations revealed the stakes arranged in a zigzag pattern, spaced 0.9 to 1.5 meters apart, exactly as described in historical chronicles. Some had broken tips, while others still bore traces of corroded iron sheathing. The wood itself was ironwood, an incredibly dense material that resists decay better than almost any other in Southeast Asia. Official excavations commenced in 1959, uncovering additional stakes, pottery fragments, bricks, and 10th century artifacts. In 1988, on the 7th anniversary, the Vietnamese government formally designated the Bach Dang stake field a national historical monument. In 2012, Bach Dang was recognized as a special national historical relic. Then, between 2019 and 2020, archaeological surveys near Heong revealed even larger, previously unknown stake fields, indicating that the defensive preparations were far more extensive than historians had assumed. Today, some of these stakes are displayed at the National Museum of Vietnamese History in Hanoi. They appear surprisingly mundane, just old wooden stakes, darkened by time, smoothed by water, and worn by years of use. Nothing extraordinary, unless one knows their history. Yet, it is precisely in this ordinariness that their significance lies. These were not mystical artifacts or lost technologies. They were simple wooden stakes, a common tool humankind had utilized for millennia. They proved incredibly effective because they were flawlessly deployed at the right place, at the right moment, against the appropriate foe. The Battle of Bach Dang became foundational to Vietnamese national identity. It is not merely a military victory studied in schools and commemorated by monuments. It is a national symbol of Vietnam's resistance to foreign invaders, a demonstration of Vietnamese ingenuity against overwhelming force, and a testament to the Vietnamese people's resolve to employ any available means to defend their independence. During French colonial rule, Vietnamese patriots drew inspiration from the history of Bach Dang. It served as proof that Vietnam could overcome a vastly superior foreign power by applying intelligence, determination, and a clever understanding of the terrain. During the American War, North Vietnamese strategists directly referenced Bach Dang as a model. General Vo Nguyen Giap, who planned the Tet Offensive and many major campaigns, meticulously studied Tran Hung Dao's tactics. The core lesson consistently remained: technologically superior invaders can be defeated by defenders who better comprehend the local environment, are willing to employ unconventional methods, and possess the patience to execute complex plans over extended periods. To fully grasp the magnitude of this achievement, one must recall that in 1288, the Mongol Empire stretched from Korea to Hungary. They had conquered Khwarezm, crushed the Islamic Caliphate, devastated Eastern Europe, subdued Rus, and, after decades of warfare, overthrown the Song dynasty. It was the most expansive, contiguous empire in human history, ruling over 100 million people. Every formidable adversary they encountered was vanquished: the Jin state, Khwarezm, Kiev, and Rus, the Eastern European kingdoms, the Song. Some of these were among the most advanced states in the medieval world, possessing centuries-old military traditions and cutting-edge technology. The Mongols defeated them all, yet they could not break Vietnam. 3 attempts, 3 defeats. The third defeat at Bach Dang was so complete and devastating that they never tried again. Kublai Khan died still planning a 4th invasion, but his successors abandoned the idea. Vietnam belongs to a very short list of powers that successfully resisted Mongol conquests. Japan achieved this twice, thanks to typhoons that destroyed invading fleets. The Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt halted the Mongols at Ain Jalut in 1260, preventing their expansion into Africa. And Vietnam did it 3 times. The final instance involved using wooden stakes synchronized with tidal rivers. Consequently, this battle further demonstrates the limitations of sophisticated military equipment when it is employed without a proper understanding of the local environment. The Yuan dynasty possessed some of the greatest military technologies of the 10th century. These included composite bows with astonishing range and penetrating capabilities, siege engines capable of dismantling fortified cities, early forms of gunpowder weaponry, and ships designed by Chinese master craftsmen who had refined naval architecture over centuries. None of these advantages mattered at Bach Dang. All that technology, expertise, and skill proved useless when applied under conditions that negated their superiority. Modern armies continue to encounter this issue. American forces in Vietnam during the 1960s and 1970s held overwhelming technological dominance, boasting helicopters, aircraft, artillery, and the world's most advanced communication systems. Yet, they were defeated by an adversary employing tactics fundamentally unchanged since the time of Tran Hung Dao. Soviet troops in Afghanistan during the 1980s were equipped with tanks, attack helicopters, and modern weapon systems. They lost to Mujahideen fighters utilizing half-century-old weapons and sometimes centuries-old tactics. Technology alone does not win wars. It must be applied appropriately in contexts where it offers genuine advantages. If you fight in conditions that nullify these advantages, no technology in the world can save you. Admiral Amer learned this lesson. The Yuan dynasty learned it. Many armies since then have learned the same lesson, usually the hard way. Wooden stakes still work if used correctly. Ancient methods still work if one comprehends why they were developed. And sometimes, people you considered primitive and inferior will teach you a lesson in warfare that you will not forget. Vietnam certainly taught the Mongols a lesson at Bach Dang with wooden stakes in the spring of 1288. And we know that the Mongol Empire, which conquered territories from Korea to Hungary, defeating every major power in its path, was decisively halted by a kingdom that should have been easy prey. Sometimes experts are mistaken. Sometimes sophisticated technology loses to simple tactics, flawlessly executed. Sometimes old methods work precisely because they are old, because they have been tested, refined, and proven over centuries. The Mongol fleet held superior equipment, while Vietnam displayed strategic thinking. The Mongols possessed advanced technology, but Vietnam had a profound understanding of its native environment. The Mongols were overconfident, fueled by a streak of continuous victories, while Vietnam was driven by the desperation of resisting 3 invasions, refusing to surrender. Ultimately, intellect overcame technology, understanding surpassed experience, desperation triumphed over confidence, and wooden stakes proved mightier than warships. This encapsulates the narrative of the Battle of Bach Dang. And this is the main lesson of April 9, 1288. That is why, even 737 years later, we still remember the day when the mighty Mongol Empire sailed into the river and could never escape. If this story captivated you, if you rooted for those wooden stakes as they emerged from the water, if you now perceive simple technologies differently, then please help me further disseminate this story. Like, subscribe to the channel, and leave comments about other historical instances where underdogs triumphed not through might, but through ingenuity. For history is replete with such examples of battles where everything conventional wisdom predicted did not come to pass, where experts were wrong, and those considered primitive or inferior delivered an unforgettable lesson to so-called advanced civilizations. These stories deserve to be told, and I am just beginning to tell them. Thank you for your attention.